Chapter 13. Tapping a World of Healing. If you don't break your ropes while you're alive, do you think ghosts will do it after? Rumi. I deployed with 10th Mountain Division to Baghdad from September 2006 to June 2007. I performed a variety of jobs, including guard, medical lab, medic, and pharmacy work. My experience was a typical mosaic of long days, stress, and a variety of emotionally powerful events. In short, I was exposed to the following experiences, some face-to-face and others indirectly through my comrades: IED explosions, small arms fire, rocket attacks, sniper attacks, wounded and dead Americans, allies, and Iraqi military enemy and civilians, including women and children, mass casualty, suicide, self-mutilation, divorce, infidelity, fistfights, rape, captured and beheaded U.S. soldiers, imprisoned terrorists, smell and sights of bloody, decomposing, and burnt tissues, booby traps, destroyed vehicles, and a persistent fear of being attacked. Upon my return from deployment, I began my first year of medical school at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences USU. Even though I completed the first academic year with good grades, I noticed that my quality of life had diminished significantly. I recognized that I was no longer able to be present in the moment, and was always observing whatever was happening in my life from a witness perspective. I also replayed many situations in my mind, often thinking of how I could have done them differently. I no longer laughed much and felt burdened by my past, reminiscing about the days when ignorance was bliss. A year went by. I spoke about my experiences to a variety of people in attempts to release them or find peace from their recurrent nature. Talking about the experiences helped me a bit, but only on an intellectual level. I understood that what I was feeling was a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. I knew that I had done my best and was a force of good in this world, but my symptoms persisted even after talking about them. Then I met an old acquaintance who asked if I was open to letting her try something called EFT to help me gain freedom from my reoccurring emotions. She said it was an emotional tool and not a mental one. We spent a total of 4 hours doing the work over 2 days. The results were immediate. I literally fell back into my body from a defensive posture that I had unknowingly created in my mind. I could feel my body again and could not stop crying and laughing. I could now be present in the moment and not have half of my attention observing the situation as it was happening. I also became less reactive to whistle sounds and sirens that used to initiate in me a fight-or-flight response, as incoming rockets had done in Iraq. Overall, I regained the quality of life that I had prior to deployment. It was truly an emotional freedom technique. Since then, I have been on a constant upward spiral and have been able to transform my past into a great strength. We worked through every single memory and emotion that I was not in peace with and tapped them out. I also learned how to self-administer EFT and have been practicing it on myself whenever something new has emerged from my past. Healing the Wounded Warriors. This account was written by Second Lieutenant Ali Tokolito, with whom I am privileged to be working on a project that I believe has immense implications for the future of humankind. Lifting the suffering of one person is a great achievement. If we can lift the suffering of the estimated 300,000 troops who are returning from Iraq, Afghanistan, and other deployments, it will change our society. Such a change will point the way toward relieving the suffering of other groups in many countries who are struggling with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other ailments. A world where these conditions are reduced by even 10% is a world worth striving for. A world in which every child is taught the tools to release the emotional charge of traumatic events will be a very different world from the one we have now. Ollie, I, and a growing number of volunteers have created a new nonprofit initiative called the Iraq Vets Stress Project. The number of troops returning from overseas combat nowadays is about the same number that returned from Vietnam with PTSD, also estimated to have been around 300,000. America did a poor job of integrating the Vietnam vets into society and treating the emotional wounds of war. The result of this failure was a catalog of misery. Vets fell into alcohol and drug addiction, spousal neglect or abuse, unemployment, mental disease, and physical decline. 40 years on, the cost of that failure to society has been immense, both in dollars and in wasted lives. Those who fail to study history are condemned to repeat it. To paraphrase George Santayana, the Iraq Vets Stress Project challenges us, as a society, to make different choices this time around. It has its roots in my hearing psychotherapists talk about their success with veterans using energy psychology. I travel and speak at many conferences each year, and I heard persistent reports about breakthroughs vets were having with this method. Sometimes the stories were of Vietnam vets who suffered from decades of misery, with flashbacks and nightmares of the war. Wouldn't it be nice if every vet had access to these methods? Therapists would say, I decided to create a website where therapists offering energy psychology could connect with vets who wanted to try these methods. The Iraq Vets Stress Project was born as a project of the nonprofit Soul Medicine Institute. The Iraq Vets Stress Project today, the site is full of resources for vets, including a growing roster of dozens of coaches and psychotherapists who offer them energy psychology sessions, free or for very low fees. Coaches are available in Europe, Canada, and throughout the United States. The website also features video clips of vets who tell their stories of getting free of PTSD in just a few sessions, sometimes overcoming decades of trauma in just a few minutes. Viewers see vets trembling with agitation as they tell their traumatic war stories. Some vets cry. One vet has to leave the room to throw up. After an EFT treatment, vets are able to tell the same story calmly. When I show this video to an audience, there's rarely a dry eye in the house. And if you want to see what PTSD looks like and the human face of how effective these therapies are, watch the video on the homepage of www.stressproject.org. I also decided to start measuring precisely how much the vets were improving, so that a body of data could become available to the community of people who work with this group. A pilot study was set up, and there were some therapists who wondered why it was worth going to all the bother of doing a study, which would cost tens of thousands of dollars, thousands of hours, and take years to complete. They'd say things like, well, we see the changes in clients and they're obvious. You don't need a study to prove them. Unfortunately, you do. Studies are the dialogue through which researchers communicate, and without quantifiable changes, even the most moving stories of personal change can be dismissed as mere anecdotes. If your optometrist said, I want to perform a new kind of eye surgery on your eyes because one of my patients said it was good for her, would you be reassured? No, you'd want medical evidence, And any ethical person who works with others, whether they're a neurosurgeon, psychotherapist, or life coach, wants hard statistical evidence that a procedure is both safe and effective. And that's why good clinicians read about the latest research in their field and why new treatments are subject to experimental verification before they are implemented. The Iraq Vets Stress Project has begun to publish studies showing the effects of EFT. Just add lime juice. It's now more than 300 years since the first controlled medical experiment was performed in 1747. Dr. James Lind, a surgeon in the Royal Navy, performed an experiment to see if dietary changes could counteract the effects of scurvy. Scurvy left sailors bleeding and incapacitated, and killed more of them than the cannons of the Spanish or French fleets. On long ocean voyages, eating a monotonous diet of hardtack biscuits and salt pork, with no fresh food available, many sailors would fall victim to scurvy. Various remedies for scurvy had been proposed over the years previous to Dr. Lind's experiment. The substances suggested for consumption by sailors included 2 spoonfuls of vinegar daily, a quart of cider per day, half a pint of seawater daily, elixir vitriol 3 times a day, a daily lump of horseradish, mustard, and garlic, 1 lemon, and 2 oranges daily. Since there are 6 items in the list, Dr. Lind grouped 12 sailors suffering from scurvy into 6 groups of 2. He then proceeded to administer the suggested substance for 2 weeks, in addition to the sailors' normal diet. The group that received the citrus fruit got better much faster. In fact, one of those 2 sailors returned to active duty after 6 days, while the other one became nurse to another unfortunate enough to have received one of the other 5 treatments. Big isn't what you think. Lind's experiment may seem very logical to us today, with the benefit of 3 centuries of experience, yet at the time it was radical concept. It also illustrates the experimental principle called effect size. If you have a big effect, it takes only a small number of subjects to demonstrate it. Lind only had 12 total, but just 2 in the citrus group. But the effect size was so great that it was obvious in just 2 people. We read about pharmaceutical trials with thousands of patients, and we may be very impressed by the size of the trial, thinking that this is a big trial. But the reason it takes so many is that for many pharmaceutical drugs, the effect size is very small. Therefore, it takes a great many subjects to achieve a statistically significant result. Think of effect size this way. If you want to test whether leg amputation results in a shorter leg, you only need a couple of subjects. But if you want to test whether scratching your fingernail on the desk results in a shorter fingernail, you need to repeat the scrape thousands of times to find a result. So trials that have large numbers of people involved usually mean that the researchers are trolling for a very small effect. Big is a function of effect size, not the number of research subjects. When researchers say they found a significant effect, it usually means that statistical analysis of the data demonstrated there was just 1 possibility in 20, that the results of the study could be due to chance. That's the consensus threshold at which we believe we found an effect. When researchers call their findings highly significant, they're not just hyping up the effect. In this context, highly significant means that there's just 1 possibility in 100 that the findings were due to chance, which is a very small possibility indeed. So the amputation study could get highly significant findings with just 2 subjects, while the fingernail study might need thousands just to achieve statistical significance. Big data is finding a large effect with a high degree of statistical significance, regardless of whether it involves a cast of characters the size of a family or one the size of a nation. Erasing post-traumatic stress disorder. The first study we did with the modern psychological equivalent of scurvy looked at the psychological health of veterans before and after 6 sessions of EFT. The EFT sessions were delivered by 2 different people. One was a licensed psychotherapist who is also a professor at Marshall University Medical School in West Virginia. The other was a life coach who has worked extensively with veterans. We measured a variety of symptoms in these vets before and after their 6 sessions, including depression, anxiety, hostility, phobias, and psychotism. We also measured the PTSD levels of the vets coached by the life coach. We also took follow-up measurements at 3 months to see if the effects we'd seen in the initial sessions would hold over time. The results were amazing. When comparing the scores of veterans on standardized psychological tests after 6 sessions of EFT, anxiety dropped by 46%, depression by 49%, PTSD dropped by 50%. The severity of all the vets' psychological symptoms collectively dropped by 40%. All of the results were statistically significant. The results for anxiety and depression were highly significant. When we checked them again 3 months later, the vets had maintained their gains. The effect size was so great that only 7 subjects were required to demonstrate these big improvements. The results were published in a peer-reviewed journal, and copies of the study have circulated widely at the Pentagon. EFT is not a treatment on the approved list of therapies in the military yet. Some veterans' hospitals and military bases use it informally, but it has to pass some high thresholds before it's accepted as a valid treatment. A second study examined the effects of treating veterans intensively for a week, rather than the 6 sessions spread out over a month. The developer of EFT, Gary Craig, got a group of 11 veterans and family members together for a week, and we tested them before and after this EFT intensive. Most of these were Vietnam veterans with decades of accumulated emotional trauma. To make sure we had valid scores beforehand, we tested them a month before the study began, and a second time the day before the study began, to make sure that their symptoms weren't just decreasing due to the passage of time. Below are graphs of the psychological problem of the vets, such as anxiety and depression. When they went into the study, the first column shows the test a month before they began the intensive, and the second column the day before. Now, the last 2 columns show their results 1 month and 3 months later. This same test also allowed us to examine the breadth and severity of psychological symptoms. If this jargon could be translated into how bad the pain is in each area, more than 2,000 years ago, the Buddha identified human suffering as the basic existential problem, and these 2 broad measures tell us how deeply and broadly unhappy experimental subjects are. The results showed that the breadth and severity of their unhappiness decreased dramatically in the big picture after EFT. Finally, we looked at PTSD and found the same large drops They walked into the intensive with severe PTSD on the scale used in military evaluation, called a PCL-M, and walked out PTSD free. These excellent results held up when we retested them a month later and 3 months later, despite the fact that they'd gone back to all the daily stresses of their lives. With these two pilot studies in hand, and with the help of the many selfless volunteers in the Iraq Vet Stress Project, I designed a large nationwide study of veterans with PTSD. A dedicated EFT psychotherapist from Toronto named Crystal Hawk volunteered to be the study coordinator, and Ollie and others joined the team. This study is also much more ambitious in that it's both randomized and controlled. There's a control group, and when vets volunteer for the study, they're randomly assigned to a group that either gets EFT right away or waits for a month, while we see if their symptoms subside spontaneously. This study will eventually analyze data from more than 100 veterans and meet much higher standards for stringency than the two pilot studies, which helped us work out the design of the nationwide study. The danger of re-traumatization. As Vietnam vets will tell you, PTSD is hard to overcome. You can't think yourself out of it. Sitting in an office of a coach or psychotherapist and talking about your combat memories might help, but remembering the horrific scenes of carnage might also put you back into the scene and make you feel much worse. This process is called re-traumatization. Fortunately, re-traumatization, when using energy psychology, is rare. A group of therapists was surveyed to find out which therapeutic methods they used at different times. They reported that when they were dealing with clients dredging up horrific memories, they preferred energy psychology because they observed that it did not re-traumatize clients. Other research has also shown that when people use these methods, they can remember the most traumatic memories without triggering a new stress response in their bodies. Asking provocative questions. Research like the ACE study, which showed that people with unresolved childhood trauma have higher rates of cancer, diabetes, bone fractures, and other maladies, has shown us the link between psychospiritual distress and physical disease. A chance incident made me wonder whether EFT could have an effect on physical problems as well. I was speaking at a bookstore recently, and after my talk, I had 5 minutes to do a demonstration of EFT. A woman who had a shoulder problem stepped forward. Her arm would rise about 20 degrees to the side and front, planes of motion called flexion and extension, but no farther. I asked her why she had this limitation, and she told me that 14 years earlier she'd worked in a tiny office where they had to reach behind to open the file cabinet. The drawer was sticky, and the repetitive motion had hurt her shoulder, so she had been limited ever since. I asked if there were any emotional incidents in her life around that time, and she remembered that her son had been in a lot of trouble at school, and a bad relationship with a man she'd lived with had just ended. And we tapped on her son, the relationship, and her shoulder very briefly, since I was out of time. I then asked her to raise her arm. She lifted up and up and up, and her eyes opened wide. She stared at her arm as though it belonged to someone else. Her mind grappled with this unfamiliar reality. She now had twice the joint rotation she had had 5 minutes earlier. After seeing similar incidents of increased joint rotation, I began to wonder if this effect could be replicated, so I designed a randomized controlled blind trial using people with shoulder problems. We advertised in physical therapy clinics for patients who had limited range of motion, and then put them into 3 groups. One group, 16 subjects, got EFT. The second group, 18 subjects, got all the verbal parts of EFT, minus the tapping. Instead of tapping, these groups did deep breathing instead. I picked this intervention because I wondered how much of the effectiveness of energy psychology is due to unearthing emotional issues, and how much is due to the physical act of tapping as an acupressure stress point. The third group, 13 subjects, got no treatment. We tested the 2 treatment groups before and after, a half-hour coaching session, and again a month later. We measured the precise number of degrees of extension, flexion, and other specific planes of rotation of their shoulders. Both treatment groups gained a lot more range of motion in their bad shoulders after working on the emotional issues underlying their physical problems, an average about 27%, closer to a normal range across all planes of movement. But the group that received the EFT kept on improving and was 73% closer to a normal arm swing after a month. The breathing group didn't do as well. Pain also dropped dramatically. The deep breathing group was 32% better after treatment, and the EFT group 48% better. But in a month, the breathing group was still 32% better, no further improvement, while the EFT group had kept improving and now had 57% less pain. The group that got no treatment didn't improve much at all in either pain or range of motion. This is an example of how research questions get asked and answered. I had a chance experience at a conference, and it left me wondering if it could be replicated. This is how anecdotal evidence can be translated into an evidence-based outcome study. Fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. Do other physical problems respond to EFT? There are thousands of accounts on the EFT website of people who've recovered from all kinds of ailments. Several other clinical trials of EFT are underway. One, that was recently published in a medical journal, was performed by Gunilla Brattberg, MD, of Lund University in Sweden. She examined the effect of EFT on patients suffering from fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia is a chronic disease that is marked by muscular aches all over the body, low energy, poor sleep, and impairment of cognitive ability, tagged fibrofog by sufferers. It is closely associated with chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS, and many physicians believe they are the same disease. Fibromyalgia and CFS sufferers have often digestive difficulties in the form of irritable bowel syndrome, as well as headaches, anxiety, depression, memory and coordination problems, and decreased sex drive. Fibromyalgia and CFS affect primarily women. About 10 million women between 25 and 45 years of age are believed to be affected in the United States alone. There's no cure for fibromyalgia, and the available conventional treatments use painkillers, antidepressants, and other drugs to control the symptoms. Dr. Brattberg conducted a randomized control trial. The 86 women who enrolled took an 8-week online self-help course of EFT. They reported significant improvements in their levels of anxiety, depression, vitality, mental acuity, and coordination. Their pain went down by an average of 29%. The great success obtained by the women in this study is consistent with the theory that EFT reduces the stress response. With lower stress, psychological problems improve, and with them the digestive, reproductive, and musculoskeletal systems are freed up from the biological demands that are imposed by the fight-or-flight response and can resume normal function. What surprised me about this study was that it was all done online, without the individual therapy sessions used in other studies. And this opens up the possibility of developing online courses to help with many other diseases, making the best methods available in the homes of patients without stretching our stressed medical systems even further. Unhealed healers. As I travel around the world, speaking at conferences to audiences that often include many nurses, doctors, psychiatrists, social workers, and psychologists, it's hard not to notice what a stressed group of people healthcare workers seem to be. Surveys show that working in healthcare is one of the most stressful occupations on the planet. So I began to collect this data on healthcare workers before and after my talks. Usually I spend about 20 minutes hitting them over the head with so many authoritative scientific references that they're dazed into submission. Once they realize that there's a sound genetic and neurological basis to energy psychology, I get them tapping. They have only to tap one time to realize the power of these methods. After that, a room full of skeptics becomes a room full of curious explorers, and we start to see emotional shifts. I began to have the healthcare workers complete psychological tests before and after these half-day epigenetics and tapping sessions. Eventually, I had data from more than 200 people. The results were as striking as they were for the veterans. The breadth of conditions like anxiety and depression scores dropped by 40%, and severity by 34%. Pain dropped by 68%, and cravings, such as for chocolate, cigarettes, alcohol, and drugs, were reduced by 83%. Who wants an addict with keys to the drug cabinet? My hope is that this kind of hard data will inspire healthcare workers to take care of their own high stress levels and then share these methods with their patients. Even high performers improve dramatically. Here's another research question that dawned on me. If these methods work so well with sick people, how would they work with healthy ones? With the help of colleagues, I designed an experimental way of testing the elite athletes. Several stories have appeared in newspapers and magazines in the last few years about athletes using EFT. The Oregonian newspaper ran a story about a fabulous young baseballer, Jorge Reyes, who was caught tapping during a game by the ESPN camera. Golf Week reported on the many pro golfers who use energy psychology to improve their game. Sports psychologists working with top-ranked athletes, including Major League Baseballers, professional football players, and elite golfers, have described how they are able to break their performance blocks using EFT. Once the study was designed, Greg Warburton, LPC, a psychologist working with sports teams at Oregon State University, was able to arrange for me to travel there and collect data with the men's and women's basketball teams at the college. Again, we used a randomized, control-blind trial. We tested the players' ability to perform free throws, also used an electronic test of how high they could jump. After testing, they were matched into two equally performing groups based on their jump height, then randomly assigned into either a group that received EFT or one that received a placebo treatment. In this case, a reading of tips and techniques written by a former college basketball coach. The EFT and reading treatments were deliberately kept very brief, to just 15 minutes per player. The player would have their performance measured then run off the court for a treatment, and then run back to get measured again. The results were striking. The group that got EFT improved slightly in jump height, though the results were not statistically significant. But they improved dramatically in free throw ability. The difference between the EFT and the control group in free throws after treatment was a whopping 38%. Greg and I went on to design a thorough week-long athletic training designed to revolutionize a team's performance, called EFT Power Training, www.eftpowertraining.com. Our reasoning is that once we release the emotional problems that interfere with a player's performance, all their latent psychospiritual capacities become available to excel at their physical game. Taking healing to the world. At Soul Medical Institute, the nonprofit I formed to further this kind of research, we'd like to study gene expression before and after EFT. That kind of a study has a 6-figure price tag, far beyond our entire annual budget. At present, we're a group of dedicated volunteers, able to accomplish these research studies only because we can. Matched every hard dollar with about 7 soft dollars of donated time. Another researcher once asked me, "How will Soul Medicine Institute fund the next study?" I quipped, "Time to hold another bake sale." The unfortunate reality is that while drug companies have millions of dollars to fund the search for their magic bullets, and large government agencies share much the same research perspective, holistic research is usually done on a shoestring budget by dedicated volunteers. We're driven by a strong belief that these therapies have the potential to change the world by reducing human suffering. Imagine if every child had a way of reducing test anxiety. Imagine if, when conflicts such as Kosovo, Palestine, or Rwanda were brewing, teams of volunteers intervened to teach the mobs of angry people how to tap their emotional charge away. Imagine if every workplace was filled with peaceful people who knew how to dissipate the stressful patterns that otherwise enmesh them, robbing their brains and genes of productivity. Imagine if prisoners learned a way to handle the high-octane emotional violence in their environments. Imagine if drivers could effortlessly discharge their stress when traffic became heavy. Imagine if national leaders could make decisions free of the emotional tugs of nationalism, revenge, and communal competition. Imagine if you had grown up in a family in which there had been a quick way of dissipating emotional strife. Such a world is within our reach, and this new generation of therapies. The results of James Lynn's landmark study of scurvy in sailors went to the British Admiralty, who now had evidence that a simple and inexpensive supplement of citrus fruit could prevent the major scourge of sailors. What do you suppose happened then? Church bells pealed, and crates of limes were rushed to every ship on the fastest possible carriages? Unfortunately not. It was another 42 years before the Admiralty acted on Lynn's findings and started issuing citrus to sailors. Thousands of sailors died in the interim, and the Navy's capacity as a fighting force continued to be compromised through scurvy. While institutions can take a long time to change, I expect the advance being demonstrated by the Iraq Vets Stress Project will find their way rapidly into the treatment system for veterans. I also see them being readily adopted by sports teams, since it gives them a competitive edge. Businesses, too, are motivated to improve their performance. And we're seeing increased interest in EFT training by companies. You and I don't have to wait till our workplace, family, community, or government changes. We can start to do these practices every day. By releasing our reactive emotional trauma, we nudge our genes, neurons, and habits a little closer to happiness right now.